And recording started. Good afternoon, everyone.
We are live, madam.
Yes, great.
So tell me when you'd like me to start.
Yes, good evening, everybody. I welcome all of you to the lecture number 17 of the 53rd Foundation Day lecture series. Today we have with us Professor Tony McEnery, who is not new to CIL. He is a very good friend of CIL. He has been with us for almost 20 years of association with us. I think it was in early 2000s. He came to the institute and collaborated with us for the Emily corpus on several languages. Professor McEnery is a distinguished professor of English language and linguistics at Lancaster University. He has held various key positions such as the director of ESRC, Center for Corpus Approaches to Social Science, director of research, deputy chair, accounting officer, chief executive, all with economic and social research, Economic and Social Science Research Council. I think from 2013 onwards, he has been holding various positions. He was also Dean Faculty of Arts and Science, Director of Research at the Arts and Humanities Research Council, Head of the Department of Linguistics and English Language. He is a distinguished member of the Corpus Research Group, which was awarded the Queen's Anniversary Prize for its research 2015. Professor McEnery is a well-known figure, a legendary figure in corpus linguistics with several publications. His citations as on today is 22,301 with a H index of 54 and I-10 index of 128. He has written more than 250 articles, several books. His research interests are mainly in corpus linguistics in a wide range of areas across theoretical and applied linguistics. He has worked with different organizations, including the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, the Environment Agency and the Home Office, and also in the private sector with British Telecom, IBM, Nokia, and Research in Motion. He has worked on projects in a wide range of languages, including Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Polish, Portuguese, and Spanish. He has constructed many corpora, including the Greater Emily and the British National Corpus, the 2014 corpora. Even today, as many of you know, Emily remains the largest and most comprehensive collection of written and spoken materials for South Asian languages. He has been working on several projects funded by AHRB, ESRC, NERC, EPSRC, the Liverhorn Trust, the Newby Trust, and the EU on various corpus projects. He is at the moment interested in looking into issues in applied linguistics. In this talk, he's going to talk about the representation of the Muslims and Islam in the UK press. He is interested in a variety of things besides corpus linguistics, like discourse analysis and other aspects of applied linguistics and English language. He has a very impressive CV and he is in editorial boards of several journals. It will take more than an hour for me to read about his accomplishments. We are indeed very honored and privileged to have you with us today, Professor McEnery. On behalf of the Institute and on behalf of everyone present here, I welcome you to today's event, the 53rd Foundation Lecture Series, lecture number 17. Professor McEnery, now you can take your time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for a very kind and far too generous introduction. It's always been a pleasure to have an association with the CIIL. And as I was saying before, I remember very well my visit to you many years ago and the great work that we did together building the Emily Corpus. So it was a real honor to be asked to give this talk today. The talk I'm giving today is very much within the realm of applied linguistics. And it's really about how a linguist can approach very large volumes of data and by using linguistic insights, firstly, try to identify the main themes within that data. And secondly, as we'll see towards the end of the talk, use the same techniques in order to try and see how those main themes may relate to one another and also change over time. Now, the project that we had, which was funded by an organization in the UK called the Aziz Foundation, was really looking at two major questions. What were the major discourses about Islam in the UK national press? And how have those major discourses changed over time? Now, we had done two previous studies, one which had been published in 2013, and another which was published in 2019. I've given you the references to those there. The one in 2019 was an extension of the earlier study. The earlier study looked at the period 1998 to 2009 inclusive, whereas the 2009 study extended that, looking at 2010 to 2014 inclusive. The volume of data that those studies looked at was very, very large, hundreds of millions of words, because we looked at every single newspaper article in the UK which had mentioned Muslims or Islam. Now, that work went on to be quite influential, so we thought it was a very nice idea to update it and bring it up to the current day. But before I do that, let me talk to you about the basic technique that we use here. Later on, I'll talk about a more complex way of looking at this basic technique. But just let me give you an idea of what we were doing. We were using keywords. Keywords have been important within applied linguistics, certainly corpus-driven applied linguistics, for some time. But actually, the idea behind keywords is actually relatively straightforward. What you do when you do a keyword analysis is you take one corpus. In this case, I'm looking at two corpora. I'm looking at American English from 2016 and also British English from 2006 and also British English from 2006. And you compare A to B. And you ask yourself the question, what is unusually more frequent in A than B? And then you can turn it round. If you want to find out what's unusual about B or characteristic of B, you say, what's more frequent in B than A? Or even less frequent sometimes. But essentially, you're comparing frequencies of words in one collection against frequencies of words in another collection. And you're hypothesizing that where those frequencies differ, you have something interesting to look at. So here we looked at British and American English. And this is the top 19 keywords for American English when compared to British English. And you can see some obvious things which jump out at us already. The very top word, labour, well, that's actually probably caused by differences in orthography between British English and American English. Neighbourhood is an interesting word that's there. Maybe it suggests something that's cultural. Certainly congressional does. That tells you something about their political system. So you can also look at themes and things which are important there. Look at the word neighbour. That also explains then why neighbourhood is up there. Again, it's an issue of orthography. Those are different from the British spellings. So we can see people who are mentioned in America more frequently than they would be in the UK. This chap McDowell, for example. Places, Atlanta. We can see issues of orthography coming to the fore. And we can also perhaps see some ideas or things which are more topical there than they would be in the UK, like additives. So it's an interesting way, from an applied linguist point of view, of approaching a discourse analysis, because the keyword points at a range of things that might typify that discourse. If we switch it round, and we look at the UK, well, again, close up to the top, we get the word labour, again, an issue of orthography. Again, we get proper nouns in there, which indicate to us people who are important in the UK, but not the US, or who have names that are showing up in that way because the people who have the names are important in the UK. Also, we have some organisations that are important in the UK, but not the US, such as the National Health Service, the NHS. So people have used keywords because they're a quick way to go into a text, look at a very large volume of data, and start to make sense of the key differences between two sets of data when you contrast them with one another. So that's the basic approach that was used in Baker et al. 2013 and Baker and McEnery 2019 to look at Islam and Muslims. In this study, I'm looking at the question of Islam and Muslims between 2010 to 2019 inclusive. The data that we downloaded came from a press consolidation service called LexisNexis. They collect all of the newspaper articles in the UK. And if your university subscribes to this service, you can go on and find all the articles mentioning a certain word. And there I've given you an idea of the rather complex search term that we use in order to find these articles. You'll see that we're not just looking for direct references to Islam and Muslims, we're also looking at indirect references. This yields an enormous volume of data. We found just under 500,000 articles in this period, amounting to just under 400 million words. About 400,000 of those articles were less than 1,000 words long. In other words, newspaper articles are typically short. That observation might appear banal, uninteresting, but it'll become interesting for two reasons later on in this talk, which I'll refer to when we get to them. So using this corpus, we can start to begin our analysis of our data. The standard keyword tools, and I've given you an idea very early on in the talk of the most basic way in which we can conceive of keywords, point analysts towards keywords which allow access to discourses associated with some object of study. That much is clear. We can do these studies very successfully. But there are some issues in keyword studies. And one of the major issues is what I call aggregation. And I'll explain to you in a moment why I put the word Trump in there. Individual keywords may be associated with multiple discourses in a corpus, but prizing apart the discourses that a keyword links to is a matter for the analyst. So in other words, if we find something like the word Trump, which I have here, and we go into our corpus, we might find several discourses, in fact, associate themselves with Trump. And it can be quite time consuming to break those discourses apart and identify them. We can, of course, use different approaches to doing this, and something that we often do is to group keywords into themes. So we can say, well, an important discourse in here is conflict. Muslims are associated with conflict, and these are the keywords which seem to be linked when they're associated with conflict. But again, this is something which is done usually through close reading and work by analysts. So both disaggregation of keywords into separate discourses and also grouping of keywords together to index a discourse are quite time-consuming tasks done by an expert analyst, but of course also relatively error-prone. So these approaches have limitations. The creation of meaningful categories and the assignment of keywords to those categories involves some element of compromise, especially as keywords may contribute to more than one discourse. And determining where this happens is again a matter for the analyst. Remember the word Trump, because later on in the talk, when I use the new technique in order to look at the large volume of data I've just talked about, you will see that the word Trump is one of these words. It is a key word, but it links to several discourses. So remember the word Trump. So what was our solution to this issue? Of course, we could have just said, well, we don't really need a solution. We're quite happy analysing the text. We've got lots of time to do it, so we'll go ahead and do it as previous studies have done. But instead, we thought that we'd look at a way in which we might systematically group keywords together into discourses and also disaggregate individual keywords which are in multiple discourses. So the approach we're using is based on covariation or co-occurrence. The method is grounded in the notion of linguistic co-occurrence. We want to see where keywords seem to be co-occurring unusually frequently. And our hypothesis is that frequent patterns of co-occurring keywords may reveal common representations or discourses. So, for example, to go back to the Trump example, if I have a keyword Trump and I have two other keywords, one is conflict, one is war, and one is ban, I may discover that when Trump associates with war, what I tend to be looking at are articles about conflict in the Middle East. Whereas when this other keyword, Trump and ban, occur in the same article, the articles tend to be about Trump proposing a Muslim travel ban to the US. So we're looking into texts and trying to see how often these keywords co-occur together. And if it's unusually frequently, we hypothesize that that might be a strong sign that when those keywords co-occur, you're looking at a discourse. So this idea of patterning is what we're looking at, and it's our approach to trying to use keyword analysis in a way which is automated and which allows us to automatically break the keywords apart into discourses and to disaggregate those keywords which occur in more than one discourse, you place them automatically into more than one discourse. In doing this, we of course were also informed by the work of Biber on multidimensional analysis, where he's done a similar thing, but not with keywords. He's done it with bundles of linguistic features in order to look at register variation, for example. And that's quite helpful. And there are well-known statistical techniques that he used in order to achieve that. So Biber used multivariate statistical techniques, principally factor analysis, in order to achieve this. And factor analysis identifies patterns across numerous measured variables, which can be explained in terms of latent or underlying constructs. So the analogy with Biber's work is quite strong. However, standard multidimensional analysis as used by Biber, although it's something in principle we could have used to approach our keyword study, it's something that we couldn't do because MDA works with relative frequencies of linguistic features. Yet the relative frequencies of most grammatical features are typically only reliable estimates in text samples greater than 1,000 words, according to Biber. And of course, this is where I point back for the first time to the fact that most of our texts are very short. The great majority of our texts, about 80% of them, are less than 1,000 words in length. So one of the key features that MDA has to rely on, texts of sufficient length, doesn't actually apply in our case. We don't have texts of sufficient length. So although the idea of undertaking MDA was one which was appealing, we really felt we couldn't because of this relative sparsity of data with which we could use the approach. So instead, we chose to use something called multiple correspondence analysis. Multiple correspondence analysis is what we might call short text multidimensional analysis. It measures the presence or absence of features across texts, allowing absence, presence, and their relationship to one another to be accounted for. So we're not talking about frequency, simply absence or presence. This information is then processed using multiple correspondence analysis, which identifies and visualizes the relationship between three or more categorical variables. Now, MCA was popularized by McEnery in 1979, who used it to analyze sociological data from questionnaires, as it can be used to observe relationships between individuals, for example, people who answered questions similarly or dissimilarly. Our analogy is texts which are talking about topics in a way which are similar or dissimilar, as well as between variables. For example, which answers tend to be selected together and which are rarely selected together. Again, an analogy with our approach, which keywords tend to be selected together and which keywords are rarely selected together. So there's a compelling analogy between what we want to do and how McEnery used MCA. So MCA visualizes the relationship between individuals and variables in terms of distance, producing two clouds of points, where the points on one cloud represent the individuals and the points on the other represent the categorical variables. The distance between each point is based on how similar they are in their distribution. So the more similar things are, the closer together in this conceptual space they'll be. The less similar they are, the further away they will be. So if many people select the same responses, say, for example, in McEnery's question, these responses are closer together in the space. Now, MCA is used in our approach, much like factor analysis is used in standard MDA, to identify the major patterns of linguistic co-occurrence across texts. Conceptually, the method proposed here is similar to something called short text multidimensional analysis. However, rather than analyze lexical and grammatical features, we instead analyze keywords produced through keyness analysis. So we had our target corpus and we had our reference corpora. If you like, here we're comparing these pairs in order to generate keywords, generating 9 keywords lists. Something I've skipped over lightly so far is the metric that we use in order to decide that there is an important difference in frequency between two lists. In this case, we've used a measure called log likelihood. We've used a threshold for log likelihood, which says that if we see a difference which we think has a p-value less than this, we'll count that as a significant difference. We also tried to introduce a dispersion threshold just to try and iron out any issues where individual texts were, if you like, skewing our analysis. So keywords need to occur in more than 5% of our texts. But also we weren't particularly interested in keywords which were everywhere in the corpus. So they're in more than 95% of the text, we ignore those. So we're trying to sort of look at this group of keywords which aren't everywhere, but also they're not coming from just one or two texts. And then we went through each text and recorded a data matrix of each of the 567 keywords, saying whether they were present or absent. Notice this was done automatically. And this is the point where we're getting to the MCA. We're interested in frequency when we generate the keywords, but when we look at individual articles, remember the keywords are based on whole years, big collections of articles, but when we look at the individual articles, we do the MCA analysis, and there we're interested in only presence or absence. So we can generate the types of findings that you get there across the bottom of the screen, where we can generate these coordinates, absence, presence, and for individual files, we can generate dimensions of variation and place them upon them. So these individual files, the individual newspaper articles, then become a bit like the individuals in McEnery's study who filled out a questionnaire. So we do all of this magic, and what happens? We actually generate 9 dimensions for looking at Islam and Muslims in the UK press. How we did this is we generated the dimensions, and in McEnery's approach, dimensions come out in pairs, A opposed with B. And then what you need to do is analysts need to look at the texts which are associated with those dimensions and see whether the clustering that has happened makes some sense from a linguist's perspective. So we had this approach, we ran it, it generated a large number of dimensions, but we are arguing that only 9 of those are important. Why do we say that? Well, to interpret the discourse associated with the dimension, we manually analyze the texts most strongly associated with that dimension. One analyst, Clark, analyzed all dimensions, with the other two, myself and Gavin Brooks, analyzing 50% each. The analyses were carried out independently, and we compared our analyses afterwards. And actually, there was broad agreement between the separate analyses, and the analysts agreed on one set of labels to apply to the dimension quite easily. So we go into each dimension, and in each dimension, we find a positive and a negative. We look at them, the positive dimension, the negative dimension. Just think of those as two different spaces rather than actually being associated with the sort of mathematical concept of positive and negative. We have pairs of dimension, pairs within each dimension. We analyzed them, we compared them, and we agreed. Once we got to the point where we found clusters which made no sense to us, we stopped the analysis. So for us, it was dimension 10. We all looked at it and thought it was actually not useful at that point. So our technique brought out 9 dimensions, and in each dimension, we have 2 groups which of keywords who seem to be in opposition or in tension with one another. Here is dimension 1. It's simply long versus short texts. I mentioned that there'd be a second point, which the importance of short versus long text in the newspaper collection that I talked about earlier would be important, and here it is. The first thing that the technique does is rightly and accurately sort apart long texts from short texts. Now, this isn't very interesting linguistically, so I'll move on from it. And actually now I'll spend quite some time talking about the 8 dimensions which lay beyond that and how they relate to discourse. So dimension 2 had a pair of discourses in it. One, war, terrorism, and conflict, which seemed to be in tension with another discourse, everyday life and events. So war, terrorism, conflict was on the so-called positive side of the dimension, everyday life and events on the negative, and I'll use that layout in each example from now on. So the keywords strongly associated with positive dimension 2 include those related to war, conflict, terrorism, as well as keywords which describe people tied to the events being reported. Other keywords represent ongoing investigations and are used in articles on news events related to war, terrorism, and conflict. By contrast, the keywords strongly associated with the negative dimension 2, everyday life and events, are used to describe entities and encode personal opinions and feelings. Unlike the positive dimension 2, these keywords are not connected by a consistent topic, but vary in this regard. However, some of these keywords are used to discuss politics, for example, and business. Overall, these keywords are used in the articles associated with negative dimension 2 to encode personal opinions and stances on a range of topics, including politics, work, and business, as opposed to war, terrorism, and conflict. It's interesting to note that this first meaningful dimension is consistent with previous research, which found that war and conflict was the most common press discourse of Islam between 1998 and 2015. That was reported in those 2 earlier studies, which I mentioned. So if you like, the first contentful dimension that we come from is very much in line with previous studies, which were carried out by hand and eye analysis, which said this. Let's look at dimension 3. Many of the keywords strongly associated with positive dimension 3 refer to foreign and UK-based politicians and different countries, places, and citizens. So you'll note here I'm trying to highlight these keywords for you as I talk about them. And I should also note that these are just an example set. It's not the full set of keywords. It's just a set of examples to show you the types of keywords I'm talking about. Okay. And also used to introduce overseas countries and leaders, as I've shown now. Many keywords associated with positive dimension 3 are used to discuss foreign affairs through reference to intergovernmental and political groups, such as these, while other keywords relate to international military action and war. Finally, some keywords are used to report on discussions and negotiations of foreign affairs nature, like that. Overall, keywords in positive dimension 3 are used to describe issues relating to foreign affairs, including international trade and agreements, such as the Iran nuclear deal, as well as global security and relationships, especially in relation to the rise of ISIS in the context of the Syrian civil war and the refugee crisis that arose from it. By contrast, the keywords strongly associated with negative dimension 3 report on local incidents and domestic affairs. Many of the keywords refer to crimes and criminal investigations, and to the people involved in those. Some of the keywords associated with negative dimension 3 denote the locations and times relating to these events. Other keywords associated with negative dimension 3 include verb forms which encode stance and details of the event, and often co-occur in articles containing accounts of eyewitnesses or those who knew the individuals involved. Finally, there are keywords referring to social media. Overall, these keywords are used in reports of local terror attacks, domestic affairs such as local crimes, and law enforcement investigations. The most common pattern of variation across the article and the corpus, the second most common pattern, relates therefore to Islam and Muslims and places them in relations to either international or domestic affairs. As the second most important dimension, this indicates that Islam is often represented as a global and national security threat, and Muslims as criminal perpetrators. And you'll note, by the way, at the bottom of each slide that I've given you a press article that links to these dimensions, or these parts of the dimension. And I think if you look up some of these titles online, you'll be able to read the articles. You can just pop them into Google or something. Okay, let's look at dimension 4 and begin with a discussion of positive dimension for Western political conflict. Positive dimension 4 is characterized by reporting which links Muslims to Western political conflict. The keywords strongly associated with the positive side of this dimension focus on terrorist attacks, political processes, and legal actors and actions. Evaluation is apparent, as is reporting of speech and writing. The Muslim community, and often specifically the British Muslim community, is placed relative to the actors and actions discussed, especially with respect to hate crimes and discrimination experienced and enacted by them. The political context in which these events are situated are Western, more specifically the US, Europe, and Britain. Many of the keywords co-occur in articles discussing the political far right and anti-Muslim bias expressed by such groups. For example, some articles report on Donald Trump's sharing of anti-Muslim videos posted by the British far-right group called Britain First, yet not all articles featuring these keywords focus on the persecution of the British Muslim community. Rather, many link to cases where Muslims persecute other groups. And note that we've had a cite here of Trump, and you'll see him again as a keyword in the other studies. This is the disaggregation at work. By contrast, negative dimension 4, overseas conflict, focuses on exactly that. It is characterized by keywords which reference conflict in terms of scale, the actors involved, and various actions, places, and resources linked to conflict. Actions are linked to conflict both overtly and indirectly by labeling an action in the conflict, or by discussing the progress and sequence of actions linked to the conflict. These actions are then linked to groups who are engaged directly or indirectly in violence, as well as to actors who are overtly linked to the violence. There is also a clear indication of where the actions being described occur within the area controlled by a group under focus. Resources in those areas are also linked to the reporting. The actions or actors involved are often linked to words which give a vague indication of scale. Overall, the keywords in this dimension co-occur often in articles that report on the specifics of conflicts overseas, principally in the Middle East. In summary, Dimension 4 indicates that Muslims and/or Islam are often presented in the national press as security threats, criminal perpetrators who are framed negatively in political disputes, or victims who are framed positively in political disputes. The framing of Muslims as victims in the context of warfare is at best implicit. The religious identity Muslims, the key word there, is present on the positive side of the dimension as opposed to the negative, even though the victims of the violence act described in the press articles on the negative side, overseas conflict, are presumably predominantly Muslim in a country like Syria. Let's move on to Dimension 5. Many of the keywords strongly associated with positive Dimension 5 relate to UK politics and crime and law and order. Others relate to terrorism and war, risk, and Islam, while some denote people more generally. Overall, these keywords are used to discuss UK government policy on topics related to Brexit, crime, prison reform, and terrorism. By contrast, many of the keywords strongly associated with negative Dimension 5 are associated with US politics. Trump is here again, notice, so this is one keyword which keeps on occurring in different discourses, but the technique is actually plucking Trump out and putting him into the separate discourses, which is very helpful. Yeah. They relate to negotiations and events, for example, here, and also particular countries and places, and temporal information. These keywords are often used in the articles reporting on US policy, especially foreign affairs, trade deals, and events involving the presidents. Several keywords associated with negative Dimension 5 encode stance and speech, and also refer to media and social media. These often occur in the articles reporting on Donald Trump's Twitter activity. Overall, these keywords co-occur in articles that discuss US policy and foreign affairs. Many of the articles associated with the negative side of this dimension discuss Donald Trump's offensive comments on Muslims and his so-called Muslim travel ban policy. They also discuss Trump's actions relating to the Iran nuclear deal and agreement signed by Barack Obama in 2015 and new agreements with North Korea. Thus, the fourth most common pattern of variation involves articles that discuss either UK policy on one side or US policy on the other. The former tends to describe either terrorism and policies intended to control and prevent it, or the Prime Minister or leader of the opposition's stance on international military intervention against ISIS. Meanwhile, articles associated with US policy tend to describe the country's foreign relations with Iran and Russia. As the fourth major dimension, it suggests that Islam and Muslims are often discussed in the press as something to be controlled and regulated through policy, both in the US and UK. This contributes to the common discourse of representing Muslims as outsiders. The positive side of this dimension, Dimension 6, and I've summarized it at the top, you can ignore that, just focus on where it says globalization and tribalism, relates to UK politics, especially Brexit, which occurs in articles discussing the effects of the Brexit vote and particular trade deals on the British pound and the world economy more broadly. A group of keywords refers to the economy and commodities. which feature in discussions of the global economy and international trade agreements. Other keywords are used to forecast and predict, like that, and to refer to business. And often occur in texts describing and gauging the prosperity of businesses. Many of the keywords are evaluative in terms of scale, and there are many temporal and frequency keywords. There are also keywords referring to places. Overall, these keywords often co-occur in texts discussing globalization, such as a particular country's role and influence in the global economy, various trade agreements, and the success of international businesses. The keywords on the negative side of the dimension are identity focus and are used to position groups and identities in opposition to each other, in the sense that the identities and characteristics of these groups are presented as being distinct from others. The identities implicated in this are reflected in the keywords. There are keywords relating to US politics and places and regions in the Middle East. These co-occur in articles describing differences between Western and Middle Eastern culture and practice, presenting these groups as being incompatible and in conflict with each other. Some keywords refer to war and terrorism. These keywords are occasionally used to distinguish supposedly Islamic terrorism from Muslims, as well as to distinguish between different groups in the Syrian civil war. Various keywords are used in reporting of speech and communicative events, as well as stance. Note the word think there. Overall, these keywords co-occur in articles associated with the negative side of this dimension to distinguish between groups, and often to position these as being in opposition to one another. The dimension indicates that the fifth most common pattern of variation involves articles that either discuss globalization or tribalism. Articles associated with globalization often discuss the effect of Brexit on the British pound and its status in the global economy, as well as discussing international trade deals, the cost of oil, international travel to various countries, including Islamic countries. Articles associated with tribalism often distinguish between different groups. For example, the supposedly lenient treatment of criminal behaviour in a town in the UK called Rotherham, which has a Muslim community, which the newspapers claims was treated leniently when engaged in criminal activity. And that also links the tribalism to a discussion of world culture and practices versus the practices in the global West. So as the fifth major dimension, it suggests that Islam and Muslims are often presented as interacting and integrating globally, as well as being completely distinct and in opposition to non-Muslims or the rest of the world. In this way, Islam and Muslims are either represented as belonging or they're represented as outsiders. Dimension 7. Many keywords on the positive side of the dimension are associated with human rights and the legal system. Another group of keywords refers to particular places and countries, governments and leaders, and identities. Numerous keywords refer to economy, business, and trade, temporal and quantity information, while other keywords are used to draw contrasts and provide extra information. These keywords often occur in texts discussing various human rights concerns from both a positive and negative perspective, such as gay rights, the death penalty, women's rights, and violence against women. By contrast, keywords strongly associated with negative dimension 7 are used in articles describing the aftermath of local terror attacks. For example, many keywords refer to terrorism and war, including terrorist groups, weapons and terrorist methods of attack, investigations of terror attacks, and war. Other keywords relate to politics in the UK and the US, and here we have Trump occurring again. Our desegregation is working, and making statements and comments. These keywords are often used in reference to government statements and responses following terror attacks, including calls for missile retaliation, resignations, and new policies such as Trump's so-called Muslim ban. Some keywords are used to report on eyewitness accounts of terror attacks, including through the use of key mental state and perceptual verbs and adjectives. Additionally, there are numerous indefinite pronouns whose strong association with negative dimension 7 indicates some level of uncertainty about the specifics of the events being about the events. Overall, these keywords co-occur in articles reporting on the aftermath of terror attacks, drawing upon eyewitness reports, government statements, and details of the criminal investigation into the attack itself. This dimension indicates that the sixth most common pattern of variation involves articles that discuss human rights or which detail the aftermath of terror attacks. It indicates that Islam Muslims are often discussed in the national press in terms of being behind on human rights, especially women's rights, or as having caused death and destruction to innocent victims. Many of the keywords associated with positive dimension 8 are used to refer to the rise of far-right nationalism and the anti-Muslim views that are associated with it. The articles refer to the rise of the far-right political parties across various countries, especially as a consequence of Brexit and other political events across the world. Some keywords are used to refer to the refugee crisis and how the large number of refugees migrating to Europe due to the Iraqi and Syrian civil wars has led to a growth in support for far-right parties. Several keywords mark scale and importance and are often used to enumerate the supporters at various political events. Many keywords refer to religions and religious practices and building, especially those relating to Islam. These terms also often appear in articles referring to far-right social actors expressing anti-Muslim sentiment. Several keywords are used to refer to right-wing criminal incidents and terror attacks against minority groups, especially Muslims. Some keywords refer to social media and describe how far-right groups meet and share information and post their attacks. Overall, these keywords co-occur in articles which discuss and often critique the rise of far-right nationalism and its views of others. Keywords strongly associated with negative dimension 8 discuss the radicalization of Muslims. Many of the keywords are used to report on radicalized British Muslims who have fled to the UK, leaving their families to join ISIS, as we can see with the word join there. Other keywords refer to the Foreign Office and its activities. That's why you see foreign and secretary. Forms of communication, such as phone here, and criminal investigations, words like court, which are often used to discuss the Foreign Office's decisions regarding the treatment of British Muslims who joined ISIS, but who wish to return to the UK. It's the keyword return. Other keywords associated with negative dimension 8 refer to temporal information, here, for example, and general actions, which often detail when the individual left, when an event occurred, and what took place. Other keywords denote places, such as Afghanistan, and often co-occur in articles describing war and terror attacks carried out by purportedly Islamic groups. Overall, the keywords strongly associated with negative dimension 8 are used to present the process of Muslims being radicalized. The seventh most common pattern of variation across the articles in our corpus thus involves articles that either critique the rise of the far right and its promotion of anti-Muslim rhetoric, or which promote stories that describe radicalized Muslims, which ultimately contribute to a discourse of fear around Islam. Let's look at dimension 9, the last one. The positive side of this dimension here is about political actors engaged in political conflict during elections. These keywords relate to political processes feeding into an election where candidates stand. When the election is active, they are running. And at the end of the election, they may have won or lost in their bid for power. Political actors linked to major parties in the UK are prominent in these keywords and may be identified explicitly, like David Cameron, with reference to a role they hold, like Defence Secretary, or be collectivized, for example, opposition. Other keywords relate to conflict, such as battle, and co-occur in articles to report on election-related conflict, often realized through warfare metaphors. The dynamic nature of election campaigns is evident in keywords which indicate a highly mobile situation. We see words like came, left, and went. Again, these keywords are often used metaphorically rather than literally. In the election, violent actors are topical, however, either through discussions of the British Army or through discussion of violent conflicts in which the UK is involved with forces in countries such as Syria. Locations relevant to the election are referenced, for example, inside. The media are also prominent on the positive side of the dimension, as their coverage of the election is itself reported on. Additionally, several keywords are public verbs used to report on direct statements from the actors engaged in the election campaign. Articles in this part of the dimension also clearly mark the time to which their report is relevant, as you can see here. The negative side over here of dimension 9 relates to political responses to security threats to the UK. The security threats in question are criminal, relating to actors engaged in crime or violence, such as terrorists. Refugees are linked to the security threat. The British economy and its public citizens are the main target of these threats, as is one important resource, money. The public are at risk both in the UK and when they travel to regions which may be identified specifically, such as France, or more vaguely, a word like across here. In response to these threats, the newspapers offer readers intelligence assessments, saying areas are safe, for example, which they attribute, so using words like according, to expert sources like the intelligence service. These intelligence assessments often provide advice which is couched in terms of strong modality, like must. Several keywords are used to talk about how state actors, such as authorities, are reacting to the threat through a response, for example. The reactions are not always viewed positively. So several keywords associated with negative dimension 9 refer to the magnitude of the threat. It can be large, and its nature, it's a problem. Both states working to mitigate the threat, such as Britain, and those responsible for the threat, like Islamic State, are named. The naming of politicians in this part of the dimension is not common, though where it does occur, it is linked to Donald Trump's plans to address a supposed security threat from Mexico by building a continent-wide wall. And again, we see Trump here, this very complex keyword appearing in many dimensions here, once again. Okay. So those are the results in brief. I've given you a reference there to an article which discusses them in full. That's available for free online. You're quite welcome to go and read it. I'll give you the URL later. But before I conclude, I want to just talk about how we can also take this approach through time. Okay. Given that each article is time-stamped, we know which day the article came out on, and that each article is associated by a score to each dimension, as is the case here for this particular article from the Daily Mail. We can then assess the association of these articles to each dimension over time. Hence, our approach to mapping the individual dimensions over time based on keywords disaggregates our view of the discourse in two senses. We can explore the separate dimensions identified, and because our results are sensitive to change at the level of the basic structural unit in the corpus, the time-stamped article, we can look at those disaggregated discourses through time. To achieve this, we draw upon another output of MCA presented so far, the coordinates. Remember, I mentioned those early on. assigned to each article for every dimension, as we can see here. Using that, we can establish how associated each text is to each dimension of keyword variation, and use those figures to plot over time how the scale of associations of text to that dimension varies, almost like within each dimension a tug of war between the two halves of it. Which side are the articles being pulled to in each dimension? So we plotted each article's dimension coordinates over the days represented by the corpus. We also plotted a 60-day moving average by taking the mean coordinates of all the articles published in that 60-day period on the respective dimension. So the trend line, which you'll see in a moment, is an average showing how associated the articles in the 60-day period are to the particular pole of that dimension through time. This is important as it shows us, for the two discourses in each dimension, how associated the articles are to them at the particular time. If the plot shifts towards the negative, it shows a growing influence of the negative pole discourse, and vice versa. In effect, we're seeing the seesawing, or that tug of war, of influence of the discourses relative to one another. I'll show you two examples if I have time. There's one example. This is for dimension 5, which you'll remember is the UK versus US policy. Now, this graph shows changes with respect to that. It indicates that before early 2016, reportage predominantly concerned UK policy. And let me just draw a line across at 0. And you can see 2016 here, it's largely on the positive side of the dimension, which is the UK policy. One of the first peaks in early 2012 is where articles focus on equal civil marriage in England and Wales. Such articles discuss the views of different religions, including Islam, towards same-sex marriage, and interest in the finding of some earlier examples as well. The highest peak occurs in the second half of 2014 here, following the rise of ISIS, with articles discussing UK military intervention in the Syrian civil war. However, at the end of 2015, focus switches to US policy, which aligns with the beginning of the 2016 US presidential election, specifically the emergence of the candidates and the Iowa caucuses in February. Following caucuses, focus switches again to the UK here, before we see what happens when Trump is elected. So we see some real differences then begin to emerge. We see that as Trump is elected, debate generally shifts towards a discussion of US policy. So the US presidential election has a strong material effect on UK press reporting, with the period prior to his election largely being focused on UK policy, and after the election, US policy predominates as a focus of reporting in this dimension. Let me show you a second example. And again, I'll put a little line on there so that you can see where things are predominantly positive or predominantly negative. This graph shows how reportage changed over time with respect to corruption and human rights versus the aftermath of terror attacks. It shows that before 2014, about here, reporting was generally dominated by articles associated with corruption and human rights issues. For example, at the end of 2010, we get our first peak here coming along. And these are articles concerning Sakina Mohammed Ashtiani, an Iranian woman sentenced to death by stoning for alleged adultery, which made international headlines as a human rights issue, as it was viewed that the crime did not warrant such punishment. Additionally, in the first half of 2012, around here, articles concerned Libya's refusal to hand over Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, who was indicted with crimes against humanity. But by June 2014, there is a shift to reporting the aftermath of terror attacks, and this aligns with the rise of ISIS public beheadings carried out by the group, the genocide of the Yazidis, and attacks in Paris. Other troughs occur after 2015, dipping down. There's the Yazidi trough, there's another one. And they also can be connected to terror attacks that the press reports on. So shifts towards human rights in post-2015 articles here often occur as the result of deaths of influential people who have either campaigned for human rights, such as Pierre Berger, who campaigned for gay rights in 2017, or who have acted against human rights, such as Uzbek President Islam Karimov, who died in 2016. So overall, this graph is clearly influenced by terror attacks in the West, just as Trump's election influenced press reporting clearly in the previous graph. Here we can see deaths of individuals and terror attacks in the West really influencing the way in which this dimension is realized within the texts. Okay. So let me draw some conclusions very swiftly, because you very kindly listened to me talk about this topic. Our new approach here to analyzing and grouping keywords explores discourse through the lens of keyword co-occurrence, not just looking at keywords on their own, but seeing how they tend to either avoid one another when they're in a specific text or occur together. Our findings support our hypothesis that frequent patterns of co-occurring keywords tend to reveal discourses. I would hope you'd agree, after my talk through those different discourses, that the approach did indeed allow us to go into the texts and make some sense of nearly half a billion words. It was a much better and swifter way of doing it. It also is effective at providing a more nuanced account of keywords that's sensitive to the various senses and discourses that a single keyword can exhibit across the texts of a corpus. I take us back to our Trump example. That word actually participates in a range of discourses. It does so, of course, because the political actor concerned, Donald Trump, had an enormous influence on debate in the media. So it's not surprising in some ways to see a key social actor showing up in different discourses, but it can be very difficult to demonstrate for a keyword like that which discourses it contributes to systematically. And this approach allows us to do that. So this approach allows us to group keywords systematically and then make sense of them, and we do that successfully. And it also allows us to disaggregate a keyword rather than just saying this keyword is linked to one discourse. We say, no, it's linked to several, and this technique shows which ones it links to. So the approach helps us to overcome the issue of keyword aggregation that is frequently present in corpus-assisted discourse studies, and it also allows us to look at change through time very effectively also. I mentioned that paper before and said that I'd give you a URL for it if you're interested in reading more about the technique. The URL is as shown here. What I'll do now, Uma, is I will stop sharing my screen and switch back on my camera, if that's okay.
Yeah, that would be great.
So you should now be seeing me rather than my screen, is that correct?
Yes. Thank you very much for your fantastic talk. You introduced a new technique to us, especially how to use multiple correspondence analysis, a multivariate statistical technique, to explore the interaction of discourse and subregister using keywords. Since it's a very, very interesting topic, I believe whatever generalizations you have made for analyzing the case of Islam in the UK press may be extended to other registers as well. And the idea behind it can be expanded to look into other discourses. I thank you for this wonderful talk, and now I open it formally for discussion.
May I have an early word on that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think I was also quite fascinated with the discourse. In fact, I stopped looking at the linguistics part of it and everything. I was just carried over by the content, the kind of making of the discourse, what went into the making of it, the people. It was like a theater unfolding for me from several it was like arena and discourse. It's just, I mean, we are just getting together to talk about things. But obviously there was something of relevance playing in people's minds, even as you chose the topic and everything went on in some sense. I also feel living in a very multilingual, multi-ethnic, I mean, the world together, I would have liked to see the counter discourses happening in Arabic world and others. Then what would they have been making of those events, and how would they have been playing up? I mean, how would they be picturizing the Americans and the Britishers teaming up and making the, and that would give me a feel of what's happening and what's being read, because those Muslims who are present in and are being made, like the outsiders, and they are participating simultaneously in other discourses, and their thinking is happening, and also the whole shaping of thinking that's happening, and what are we doing with discourse making, and the whole, the interdiscourses between, like intertextuality. I mean, we talk of discourses across spaces, across languages, and into the minds and flowing into it. And I think there's something more interesting happening. So I mean, I must confess that's how it intrigued me immensely.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Sachdeva. And I couldn't agree more. That's basically what I'd say. I think the tool that we've built, it's always a grand claim to say that something is language independent, but relying on a very simple feature such as frequency, although of course it may vary in how it's realized across languages. So if you look at a strongly inflecting language like Arabic, you're going to have very different issues with frequency as you'd have with a language like English, which barely inflects. So you'll find some frequency issues with Arabic if you try to look at it in a frequency-based way. But of course, the very nice thing about the multiple correspondence analysis approach is it doesn't rely on frequency really very heavily at all. It's more presence and absence. Once you've got past the point of generating keywords, you could go for presence and absence. So my hope actually is that people will pick up exactly what you've said, and they will use techniques like this, which work, I think we've demonstrated, quite well for English, and they'll use it on Hindi or Arabic or Urdu, whatever. And actually this will be a way of unlocking that sort of treasure chest of discourses that you've just nicely described to us, so that we can do more large-scale work in contrasting discourses and looking at discourses in competition. Another talk I could have given today, a book that's coming out next month, I think, there's a book we've just finished called The Language of Violent Jihad, where we look at a very different world of discourse, the discourse put forward by people who try to persuade other people to engage in violent jihad. Now, whether or not I agree with what they're doing is almost irrelevant. I can use the same analytical techniques to look at a very different approach to the world, a very different discourse. And as you're saying, contrast the two. So in that book, we look at three. We look at moderate Muslim voices, very extreme Muslim voices, and ones which we might characterize as somewhat in the middle, and try to compare and contrast those. So that point about comparing and contrasting discourses, Professor Sachdeva, I think is absolutely vital. And the better tools that we provide to people that will work with a range of languages in order to permit that to happen, the better, both as an interesting and intellectual challenge, but also, I think you talked about the theatre, opening up the theatre and seeing the different stages and understanding how they interact, if that's an answer to your question.
Yeah. I'm sure somebody else will have things to say.
Uma, can I pitch in now? Uma?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Uma.
Professor M.
Thank you, Uma. Wonderful presentation, Professor Anthony McEnery. I teach linguistics at Aligarh Muslim University.
Oh, good.
It's a comment, and perhaps there'll be some implicit questions also there.
Okay.
I mean, from what Rajesh mentioned, of course, I was moved more by the discourse angle that was there in your presentation. And I was connecting it to the dimension 4 that you talked about, which is largely hinting at the social position, social representation and subject positioning of people. Now, my comment is that the social presentation and representation in discourse that invariably becomes a political import in terms of handy tool of the media that is there, that furthers the interests of the political groups in engaging in marginalization and exclusivity. In fact, it profiles humans rather than behavior and positions the subject in relation to self and others.
Yeah.
And legitimizes the identity processes. So what is happening in the discourse or discursive storylines used in media as a platform of public discourse is not only, it is locating people within social relations, but also profiling them.
Yeah.
And positions the subject in relation to self and others. And it also generates social relations or representations that are exclusive and marginalized. And there are plenty of examples in history. The most recent that occurs to my mind is what had happened, the incident that took place in Orlando in US, where a former Marine person named Yusuf, who protected the lives of about 40 people who were killed by a person in a Purse club, which opened fire and killed 49 people. What is happening is that the content in the media, the discursive storylines in the media, it carried the information that what is happening there is not the Islamic paternal identity of Yusuf that is Islamic, but the media discourse positioned Yusuf in other identity from the maternal side through language use and meaning construction. And as a critical social link, critical discourse analyst, I wonder if this positioning and social representation is merely an act to contribute towards social knowledge, or is it a reflection of people for marginalization and exclusion?
Yes. Well, thank you very much for that, Imtiaz. It was a very well-timed comment, and it was very well supported with a good example. I'll make two comments. One, we have talked before, not here today, but we have talked before about how sometimes people's religious identities, especially Muslims, are only deployed in the UK press in negative terms. So there was a very good example we used to use of a UK runner called Mo Farah, who won gold at the Olympics in 2012. Now, Mo Farah was very clear that his religious identity, he was a Muslim, was very important to him as an athlete. You know, he sort of drew strength from his faith. And he went on record saying this, and the press barely reported it. By contrast, another athlete who was a Christian made the same comment, and he was then known as the born-again Christian athlete. So there are clearly choices being made within individual newspapers about how they do representation in just the way that you described it, Imtiaz. One thing I cut out of the talk today, which I now regret, but it was a long talk anyway, but one thing I cut out of the talk today, which I now regret, which is in the paper, by the way, is the type of thing that I did where I looked through time, you can also do to look across the different newspapers. So you can start to see how different newspapers interact with the different dimensions. So dimension 4, for example, you may find that different newspapers interact with it differently. It was quite interesting when we did that, in that we found with some dimensions there was almost no difference between the newspapers. But in other dimensions, you get real differences between what I would call the quality press and the popular press. And in other dimensions, you get real difference between the right-wing press and the left-wing press. press. So those choices about representation that you're talking about, Imtiaz, and individual examples like the Mo Farah one to illustrate that. But another nice feature of this technique is that you can also use it in order to very rapidly demonstrate for those dimensions how the different newspapers interact with them. And where you see differences, you can start to look, as you have, I think, in your research, at the potential explanations as to why those newspapers are seeking to promote one type of identity over another that a person may have. Is that a helpful reply for you, Imtiaz?
Thank you very much, McEnery. Thank you.
Yes, Santosh Kumar has a question. Yes, please.
Hello, Santosh.
Hi, sir. Thank you, Professor, for your talk. I was intrigued by is there any way to identify the political position of these newspaper from where you collected your data? I mean, whether they were left-leaning or central-leaning, and or if there is any sort of thing, then how they have fared with the profiling, as Professor Imtiaz was saying.
Yeah. Okay, Santosh, I think that's a very nice example because it allows me to say something I always enjoy saying in these talks. Even though the approaches that we are taking appear to be automated, in fact, all that we're doing is reducing the problem so that we can then bring our expertise to bear on it. Why is that a relevant answer to what you've asked? Well, what I would say in response to your question, Santosh, is that we then use our expertise as analysts and our understanding from other fields like journalism studies, political science, etc., of what these newspapers represent. So we can see how the patterning pulls them apart, and we can say, well, there are 4 newspapers which seem to rely in dimension 4 on the positive side, and the rest of the newspapers are on the negative side. But we then need to go back to the world, so to speak, the social world, and start to ask questions of other researchers and say, what characterizes these 4 newspapers as being different from those? So we sort of draw in that sort of world knowledge in order to inform our analysis. So people often wonder with me, are you trying to sort of put linguists out of work by doing these techniques, etc.? No. What we're doing is making the work of linguists more effective. So we then, Santosh, go to various sources and find out what the opinions of people who have such opinions are, so political scientists, for example, about these newspapers. And we say, these 4 newspapers over here are clearly right-leaning. They are widely accepted to be right-leaning. The ones over here are widely accepted not to be right-leaning. Or we say, this is the quality press, things like the Times, or this is the popular press, or tabloids, as we used to call them. So we're always deploying world knowledge or our expertise as linguists in interpreting the findings of these programs. So that's a crucial question that you asked, because we need to reach beyond the patterns that we see in order to understand and explain them.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Yes, anybody else?
I would very much love to do an analysis of some Hindi newspapers one day. If anybody wants if anybody collects the data, we have the tools, and we could certainly share them with you, and you could sort of try it on Hindi, which would be quite interesting to do.
Yeah, Professor, may I?
Yes, please.
Actually, I have collected some corpus on from Hindi newspaper, but those corpus is on how the person with disability have been represented in the Hindi media. So
Right.
I put the keywords on different kind of disability that we have and the terms for it, but because of the lack of tool, I was not able to formalize it like your presentation. So I would really appreciate your help in analyzing and formalizing those data.
Yeah. Well, feel very free to send me an email, and we'll see what we can do, because it would be very interesting to see the technique work on a language other than English. It's a very new technique. We've only used it on English. As I've said, I have views about it being relatively language independent, but it's always nice to demonstrate that rather than to simply assert it.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I would reach to you.
My pleasure, Santosh.
Yes. Any other question?
It's getting towards lunchtime here, so if there are no more questions, I can have my lunch.
I have a couple of questions for you.
Sure, sure.
So, see, I was very much fascinated with your talk, and since I have some experience in statistics with a bachelor's degree, so I was wondering, because so my questions are going to be a little bit different from what you have heard now. So, see, you were explaining us about the multiple correspondence analysis, and you use the co-occurrence techniques.
Yeah.
And you also showed some kind of analysis, and I was curious, what other techniques did you use? What kind of covariance analysis did you use? Because you mentioned about, I don't remember that slide, but there was one slide where you had the, you showed in 3 rows, one value which had a p less than 0.05, and
yeah. Well, that specific statistic was something called log likelihood, which is a significant statistic which tries to infer whether or not in this case, whether a difference in frequency between corpus A and corpus B is significant or not. There are arguments against using that, I must be honest.
Mm-hmm.
The principal arguments against using that is really related to the question of whether or not null hypothesis testing of that sort really does relate well to language. Some of the ideas behind the...
In that case, in that case, am I allowed to assume that you also framed some null hypothesis for this research?
That's right, i.e. that there is no association between them. But the basic question is relating to the distribution, which often is assumed to be a normal distribution.
Normal distribution, okay.
And language is not normally distributed. We know this.
Yes.
So my view of the use of log likelihood in contexts like that is its use is heuristic rather than being of the same sort that you might use in a context where the normal distribution hypothesis does hold. So that was the one that we used there. I think we give much more details on the specific clustering that we use in the paper. It escapes my mind for the moment. But I would say also that there are some other techniques that we're looking at using, like sparse principal components analysis instead. That's one that's been mentioned. So we're still looking around at what best techniques are. But I've always been a believer in the evidence of my eyes. So when the techniques ran and we got our dimensions, the confrontation with reality that I wanted to expose the ideas to was whether the collections of texts at the end looked sensible. We could put a sensible label against them. It looked as though it was a successful discourse analysis. And also whether the texts that we got at the end seemed to be relating well to the scores put against them. So if something gets a high score on dimension 2, if I look at the newspaper's article with a high score on dimension 2, are they really principally about what is on the positive side, for example, of dimension 2, or is it not the case? So in the end, the sort of main tests that we put the statistics to were ones of evidence, looking at the text and seeing whether they seem to produce good results. But there certainly are, I think you're right, some issues that we could address from the point of statistics.
Yeah, so I was also curious to know, see, number one, you were talking about the analysis through time. And
Yeah.
If I recall, you had looked into your corpus from spanning from 2010 to 2019, almost a decade. So did you see the changes among the press themselves, changes in their attitude over the years? Because sometimes within, you said in some cases like Dimension 2, for example, if the UK press was positive and the US policies were negative, did any change happen even among the US press over the years, like in the second half of the decade?
Yeah, and it's very strongly driven by Donald Trump, I think, is the answer to that.
Okay, so that would be good.
He has an enormous impact on the media, and that's why that keyword is so complex. He appears in most of the dimensions because a lot of media reporting orients towards him, unlike Obama. So you don't see him in the earlier half, but Trump is a much more dominant figure in media terms. So that for me is
say the Obama period, you will see a difference in the attitude of the people and how they are clustering, how they have given the news item. And also I was curious, that is about the press, and I'm sorry, I should not take others' times. One last question from my side, that's something to do with linguistics.
Okay, good.
So mainly semantics, because when we are using keywords and we are trying to do clustering, I noticed that you have 9 dimensions and a few cluster of words. And also in your talk, implicitly you used subclustering because temporal relations were there, adjectives were there, or maybe some religious concepts were there, or political concepts like Trump coming every now and then. So in most of the cases, or many other issues. So there are obviously subclusters there. I was wondering if one could use lexical relations related to these clusters and form subclusters. For example, you have Trump, and maybe you will relate it with his office. So you can have holonyms, you can have hypernyms, or you can have metonyms or synonyms, for instance, because sometimes we use also metaphors and metonyms. So maybe in the positive sense as well as in the negative sense, it's possible to form subclusters and map them to the keywords and see whether you get the same results or what happens with the interpretation. It's just a loud thinking.
Oh, it's a very good thought. I've been typing while you've been talking. I hope I haven't appeared rude, purely because I have a paper that I think might be relevant and interesting to you, Uma. You made a very good point, and in fact it's a point I've implied so far, that while I've been trying to move away from the aggregation of discourses around a keyword, i.e. saying a specific keyword might relate to multiple discourses and we need to break it apart and put it into those different discourses, there are other aggregations at work. So in my presentation, I talked about the press monolithically when I described the dimensions. 2010 to 2019, the dimension is this. When I was replying, for example, to Santosh and Rajesh, I implied that you can use the technique to break it down into individual newspapers, and you see variation there. So that's your subclustering idea coming through strongly, I think, there. Also, in the paper, we talk also about how subregisters sometimes form subclusters as well. So sometimes you actually look at the articles and say, this is actually not just the register of the newspaper. It's a specific subregister within the newspaper. So you're right, there are sort of multiple levels at which aggregation is still happening. But as analysts, we can go in and break it apart. The interesting question, I think this is what you're pushing towards, relates to meaning and usage. So if you look, say, at the words and the words associated, at a word and the words associated with it in specific contexts, say, for example, topics, you may find certain collocations, I would call them, but associations becoming stronger and weaker. And this may actually be a sign that this word has a life, if you like, a semantics associated with it. but that specific features of the semantics seem to be selected by specific topics. A very good one, I think, would probably be war. In the context of the reporting of armed conflict, the words associating with war would be very different from in the context of a political campaign where it's metaphorical. And you may be able to see that. We did write a paper looking at how you can look at co-occurrence in order to look at meaning change over time. And it does work quite nicely. And I'm going to put the URL for the paper into the chat so that people can go and have a look at it. It's open access, so it's just there. Because it could even be the case at any one moment in time, you have a word which has multiple meanings, or in the case that I've just talked about, maybe metaphorical or literal, and that you could find patterns of association to subcluster those as well. Or a word is actually changing its meaning over a relatively short period of time, or selecting from different meanings in different contexts. But you can use patterns of association to start to get an indication of where you might be seeing these significant shifts in usage. So the paper that I've just sent through is actually about a technique which looks at co-occurrences to look at where shifts in usage, in this case through time, might be occurring. But you could look at use the same technique and look at shifts across genres or across subregisters or something like that. That was quite a long answer, Omar, but simply because it was a very interesting question.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I think I took so much time. Thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
You've all been terrifically kind to listen to me talk about this topic.
Yeah, it was lovely. Yeah.
I'd just like to say again, what a pleasure it is to be back, even virtually, at the Institute. Certainly when I visited in 2000, 2001, something like that, it was one of the best days of my life because it really allowed me to expand the range of work I was doing on South Asian languages at the time. We hadn't done anything on Telugu, for example, and you had Telugu data. It went like that. It was a wonderful meeting of minds that day. I had things you didn't have, you had things I didn't have. If we shared it, we actually produced something better than either of us could ever have done. And it is actually amazing that that corpus is still the biggest, best, broadest collection of South Asian corpus data that's available in the world today. And it's an enormous source of pride for me to have worked with you in doing that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are indeed proud of our past collaboration with you since the early 2000s. And I recall Shri B.D. Jairam.
Yeah, B.D. Jairam, yeah.
Yes, he was associated with you, and I think he also visited your university, and you guys worked. So we had a long conversation, and we are looking forward for a future collaboration as well, so that we can work on more items. Like, I do not know whether a work little bit initiated by Professor Omkar Nath Kaul, who is no more, but he initiated that for a few languages. And let me find out from others to the links to it, and if at all we have access to it. Because you were asking me about news items of other Indic languages. Like Santosh said, he had something of Hindi. Likewise, Omkar Kaul did work on Kashmiri, Punjabi, and I also helped him a little bit with Tamil, but we did not publish anything. It's just...
Well, tell me more. Email me. I'd love to hear more.
I will email you all that. Yeah. Now I just would like to take this opportunity to thank you formally on behalf of the CIL, on behalf of our director, former directors, and other colleagues, each and every one of them present here. I formally thank Professor McEnery for sparing his valuable time to be with us today and for enlightening us on a new topic and opening discourses to the discourse analysis of news reporting.
Thank you.
Fantastic to have you. I also thank everyone present here for taking their time away and spending almost an hour and a half with us. Like, we were very much happy to have with us Professor Sachdeva, Professor Imtiaz Hasnain, Professor Shunaram Sharma, Dr. Abhinav Mishra, Dr. Santosh Kumar, and many other colleagues from CIL and from other places in India. I thank you once again on behalf of everyone, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you here virtually. Thank you.
Lovely to see you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye.